Impact. Real human interest stories ranging from the ordinary to the truly extraordinary.
Hello, this is Fatima Hussein, and you're listening to Season 2 of Impact, the program which introduces you to extraordinary human interest stories from around Canada. In this episode, we bring to you a disturbing, hopeful, and inspiring story of Toronto resident Elizabeth Correia. Elizabeth was brought up as a foster child, became a teen mother, and is a survivor of sexual abuse and domestic violence. She is now a mentor and has dedicated her life to teaching and helping women and youth create a life they love. Her extraordinary story of transformation is the inspiration behind her mission to teach others like her that it is possible to do the same.
My name is Elizabeth Correia. My story goes back, into childhood. I mean, when I think of, when I'm often asked, what's your story? I immediately go back to childhood and what that story looked like. I was born and raised in St. Jamestown in the Regent Park area, in government housing, in extremely abusive household. My parents were very, traditionally Portuguese. They were old school Portuguese. So we did not speak English at home. It was only Portuguese. We actually learned English in school. And looking in from the outside world, it looked normal. Like we had a pretty normal family, mom and dad, both parents at home. But behind closed doors, it was so toxic and dark, extremely abusive. My parents were physically, emotionally, mentally abusive. And my father was also sexually abusive. And that abuse started as far back as I can remember, 5 or 6. I don't really know when it started, actually. That went on for my entire childhood, and when I got to about 13, 14, I started realizing that something just wasn't right. My father was always beating my mom, and when I was younger, I just, for some reason, although I felt it was wrong, I didn't feel right. I didn't know how to articulate that or understand it, and when I got to about 12, 13, I realized that, something's wrong here. Something's going on here. I don't feel good. I don't feel happy. And that started to show in some of the choices I was making as a very young girl, the crowds I was getting into. And then at 14, I finally said, okay, I can't do this anymore with the abuse of my dad. And I spoke out. I told someone. And then, of course, Children's Aid was called and the police. And my sister and I were removed from the home. And we were both put into foster care. And we were separated. And that was what felt to me more painful than what my father had been doing for so many years, because my sister and my siblings were like my comfy blankets. We protected each other, and we were literally like joy for one another, because everything else was hell. Where we were growing up, it was hell on the streets. It was constant pain and drama. And my siblings and I, we kept each other safe, and we loved each other so much. And so when we all got separated, it was extremely painful. And my sister was put into a foster home that was hours out of town. And so months and months went by and I did not see her. We went from sleeping in the same room, same bed since we were babies, she's barely 2 years younger than me, to being separated, not seeing each other for months. And that took a huge toll on both of us. She didn't know what I was going through because we had no contact communication. And then I got involved with a lot of unimaginable things, like selling drugs and hanging out with gangs and everything from guns to, it got really, really crazy really fast. And I lived my teens in that fast life, fast money, fast boys, fast everything. I really did become a product of my environment. And I would say that I didn't become an at-risk youth the first time I held a gun at 14. That was a result of what I had been living my entire childhood. So at 14, I ended up getting into a relationship with a young man who was just a few years older than I was. I met him at a basketball game, and we started talking and exchanged numbers and started dating, if I could call it that. We started dating, and things moved very quickly, very fast, and got very toxic very fast. Mentally, emotionally, physically, the abuse it happened within weeks, the physical abuse, and it got really bad, really, really bad. really fast. At 16, I got pregnant, and it was as if the abuse got worse during the pregnancy. And I gave birth to a baby boy, and I stayed in that relationship for another 3 to 4 years. And despite how abusive it was, how ugly it was, how painful it was, I stayed. And I know now that I stayed in that relationship because of the love and the acceptance I received from his family, his sisters and his mother, who loved me unconditionally. They were my sisters, and they still are my sisters. And that was my mother and still is my mother. And I know that I stayed because of the love that I received from them. They accepted me with open arms. I could disappear for 3-4 days and leave my son there at such a young age and know that he was okay, because life was a fight for me. I was constantly fighting to survive, constantly fighting to make the next dollar to live. I didn't have my parents. I didn't have my siblings. We were still separated. I had spoken to my sister again, but she wasn't allowed to communicate with me. One, because of the life I was living, and then two, she had gotten adopted and they didn't want her to communicate with her real family. So I really was alone outside of his family. And that is where I stayed, because of that love I received from his family, more so than what I got from him. So my teens were just abuse, darkness, hustle. It was crazy for about 6 years. I was 21 when I walked away from that relationship, or ran away. I continued seeing the family, of course. I stayed close with them, but I knew that I had to get away from him. And I now know that I, as a broken young woman, got into this relationship with a broken young man. My pain and what I was doing as a result was a result of what I was living, and what he was doing was a result of what he had survived and lived through. I believe my coping mechanism through all of this was my faith. And although I wouldn't call it that at that age, I now can look back and I just kept believing. I had a praying grandmother who prayed morning, noon, and night, and in the middle of the night. And I know that because my sister and I shared a bedroom with her, and she slept on her bed. So it was the three of us on a double-sized bed for years until she passed away when I was 11, which was extremely painful because she was the only person in my childhood that I knew loved me. And she believed in something, and that something was God. And she would talk about God and talk to God, and she would read all these biblical scriptures to us and teach us about the virtuous woman in the book of Proverbs. And she was just constantly speaking life into our life. And when I look back on it, I know, and I always knew, that she knew what my father, her son, was doing to me, but just didn't know what to do to stop it. My father was blind at birth. He's blind. And he was also her youngest child and the one that she had to care for his entire life, hence why she lived with us. And so as much as she wanted to stop what was happening, she really didn't know how. And she gave me her best, and her best to me was faith and hope in knowing that everything that happens for a reason. And I held on to that for years. When I left that relationship, I ended up just a few months later getting into another relationship with a young man, or he was just a couple of years older than me at the time, who was literally like a breath of fresh air in my life at the time. Like I still call him my angel to this day, because he really did get me away from that abusive, toxic relationship. I never went back to that relationship after him. It was like love. I don't really know what love at first sight really is or what it means, but it was something that happened instantly. Our connection was so deep. There was a spiritual connection, a mental connection, emotional connection. We had the most beautiful conversations. I'd never, ever met anyone like him in my lifetime up until that point, and I was 22. And he was the first person that I shared my past with up until 22, when I went into foster care at 13, just before I hit 14. I was 14, up until 22. I had never shared my deepest secrets. I never went into detail about what happened to me as a child. I barely told anyone I was even in foster care. There are people today who read my book today that didn't even know I was in foster care, because I just put on the straight face and kept going, kept it moving. And I was able to open up the darkest parts of me to this person. And we had a beautiful, healthy connection. We were together for about a year, just over a year, and we lived together. That happened very quickly as well. And then he was murdered in front of me, and he died in my arms. And that relationship relationship ended, and that crushed me on a very different level, something I hadn't experienced up until that point. The last time I had felt that kind of pain was when my grandmother passed, because I felt that same connection with him. And then after that, I believe things just got really ugly. I didn't care. I just didn't care anymore. I went into that, I don't care. I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm not going to love another man. I'm not going to give my heart away again because I've been hurt by men. And so I'm just going to do whatever. And then I just didn't care for a few years. So I know I'm so passionate about community because it was community that loved me back to life. When I was with my boyfriend who had passed, we used to go get our nails done at the salon. And every time we'd go to the salon and get our nails done, there was this woman there and she would talk about God. Like every time we went to do our nails. And just keeping it real, I was just like, okay, I don't want to go see her to do my nails today because she's just going to talk about God again. And I don't want to hear about God again. Like that is where I was at the time. But not only would she talk about God, she would just talk like normal conversations about life. And, she was always so happy and always so happy to see me. And the way she'd embrace me and hug me. And she got to meet him. And so when this happened, it took a toll on her too. She had a salon and still has in Rexdale, where we were living. And she basically took me under her wings and brought me into her community, which was filled with women and young girls who were hurting and healing. And I became a part of that community. And it was in that community that I started to become self-aware, where I started to understand what self-respect was. Because at the core of self-love, there's other components to that. There's self-awareness, self-respect, self-acceptance, self-empowerment, and then at the core of all those things is self-love. But it was a journey. There was so much to heal from. I mean, we're talking more than 25 years of pain and darkness and abuse and abandonment and rejection and self-hate. But in that community where I was accepted and I wasn't judged and I could be myself and I could talk about what I was really doing when I wasn't in those group meetings and in those sessions, and yet they loved me. That was where the healing started for me. It was the power of community. So I continued on that self-discovery journey for about 5 years. I went back to school. I surrounded myself around different people. I was making completely different choices. All the little seeds that were being planted in my life started to blossom, over about 5 or 6 years. A lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And it was a struggle. It was a struggle because I wanted to do what was right. And I wanted to live, a healthy lifestyle and just be healthy mentally, emotionally. But it was a journey. And my life was completely like night and day towards my late 20s. And I ended up getting married and I had another son, another boy, and that marriage didn't last. And it didn't last because we were still two broken people that had the right intentions, but we were broken. And so our marriage broke. It took a couple of years for that to happen. And I was divorced, trying to figure things out. Okay, now I feel like I've done everything the right way. Got married, had another baby, and I'm in full-time ministry and everything is wonderful and great, but I'm still broken. And I was broken because I hadn't dealt with those stories that I had still been believing and living in. And so there I was on another self-discovery journey. December of 2011, December 26th, I started seizuring just out of the blue. I'd never seizured prior to that. I had 4 seizures, and the last seizure that I had, I was at the top of the stairs going upstairs. It was like 15 steps, and I seizured and fell down backwards, flipped a couple times, and landed at the bottom of the stairs, and I ended up getting rushed to emerge there. They did a whole bunch of tests and told me that I had a large brain tumor and that they had to rush me to Trillium immediately to have it removed, because I had a couple of hours before I could die if they didn't get me there right away. So I call it a gift because my foster son at the time was going out the front door to go to work when I took the fall. And if he hadn't been there, I would have died at the bottom of the stairs because I couldn't talk because I was seizuring. So my tongue was like doing weird things. So I couldn't yell for my other son to wake up because he was sleeping. And that experience was hands down by far the scariest thing I have ever had to live through. Those moments of being told what I was up against. And then even when I got to Trillium Hospital, they rolled me in and I was up there with the surgeon. And everything that happened within moments, having to sign a piece of paper to sign my life away in case something happened. And I refused to sign it. And I don't remember a lot of it, but my family kind of filled me in on a lot. My sister signed it, being told that, there was a 70% chance of losing my sight or not being able to speak again or remember anything, my memory. And there was just so much and it was so fast. And all I remember doing while the doctor was speaking was praying. That's all I could do. There was nothing left. And my son, they asked me if I wanted to have any moments or words with anyone. And I said I wanted to see my older son and his grandmother, who I call Mommy. And they both came in the room and my son said to me, Mom, you have been through so much and you've survived so much. You got this. Like, you're good. And I looked into his eyes and he could barely look at me. But when he said that part, he looked into my eyes. And I looked into his eyes. And in that moment, I knew and I believed that I would be okay. I knew I was okay. And so going under, I didn't go under in fear. I went under in faith. And I know that that made a difference in the outcome. I know that. And I woke up, it was a 5-hour surgery. It was like I was on another planet. My kids looked different. The flowers and the trees outside my hospital room window looked different. I was so present. When the nurses would speak to me, I was like staring into their soul. It was an awakening that no words, unless you've experienced it, no words could describe. I call it my heavenly experience. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever experienced. I was asked by the lady who I said took me under her wings, Roma, Mommy Roma, we call her. She had asked me to share my story at church. Keep in mind, there's like 3,000 people that go to this church. So I thought she was like losing her mind. I mean, I was okay with sharing it in closed groups. I was not okay with that because now that meant that the world was going to know my story. And I thought I wasn't ready for that. But little did I know that that was the seed that was planted in my life. I was shaking and I started to share. And when I finished sharing, there was a lineup of about, no exaggeration, 50 young men and women waiting one by one in a line to speak to me. And that was the beginning of this phenomenal journey of mine as a transformational speaker, youth mentor. It was like back to back. The moment I let the world know what my story was the moment that I was empowered to be greater than I had ever been up until that point. It was life-changing on a next level. It was the brain surgery that made me realize I was still living small. I just went all in. I quit my job. I was working at Mississauga Transit, and I had written my memoir before the surgery, a 400-page memoir, handwritten, and it was just sitting there. And I woke up from the surgery. One of the first things I said to my sister, I want to publish the book. I almost died, and if I had died, no one would have known the real Liz. And there are so many girls that need to hear my story, the truth of my story, the things that I did that I didn't share, that I was embarrassed of, that I was ashamed to share. And 3 months later, when I should have been resting, from that moment, I started planning my book launch. I got it printed. I printed 1,000 copies. It was sold them like hotcakes. There was like 300 people at the launch. And that gave me a platform to soar. And so I started speaking in schools, colleges, universities. I've spoken in over 100 schools. I started creating my own youth programs, the actual curriculum. And then I started speaking in women's empowerment on the power of transformation. And then, I'm here just living my best life. And I'm nowhere near where I want to be, but I'm nowhere near where I used to be. And I'm just so excited for what's to come. I have dealt with my own kind of discrimination and racism, believe it or not. My parents did not speak English. And so I experienced racism from a very young age. I knew what it was in so many ways. I remember when I first started speaking and some of the things that I would hear in terms of, you're from the projects, you're from the hood, what are you going to speak about? And I lost a lot of friendships because of that. And so according to society, or to a lot of people, I'm not supposed to have school partnerships as a speaker to change lives because I was a high school dropout and some of the things that I did. And that was hard. People thinking that I just didn't deserve that. I wasn't worthy of that. One of the things that I had to master was self-love. I just couldn't understand how to love myself more, and I had to study it. And what I now know is that self-love sets the standard for how you're loved and treated by others.
That was Elizabeth Correia describing her journey from pain to purpose. To find out more about Elizabeth, visit elizabethcorreia.com. You can now access Impact online on SoundCloud and Spotify at Vibe105TO. And before we leave, we'd like to extend our thanks to Elizabeth Correia and VX3 Exchange.
Impact is a production of VX3 Exchange, featuring the stories of extraordinary people, sharing their stories again and again at vx3exchange.com or our social platforms at VX3 Exchange.